It was a day few thought they'd ever see. A year ago this month, more than 50 years of strained relations between Cuba and the US drastically changed. Prisoners were released. The US Embassy in Cuba hoisted its flag over Havana, and the process of a normalization in relations officially began. In the months that have followed, diplomatic ties have been re-established and travel restrictions from the US eased. But for some, meaningful change is still out of reach. The Cuban activist known as El Sexto has been described as the most persecuted artist in Cuba. He was jailed for almost a year for criticizing the Cuban government and says things have got worse on the island.
If it's a negotiation, you're supposed to give a part to Cuba, and Cuba gives their part. But I haven't seen much progress with respect to that. Only more repression, more detentions and immigration.
And some say the improving relations has also been the driving force behind a recent spike in Cuban migration. In the last year alone, more than 40,000 Cubans have made their way to the US, fueled by a fear that the so-called wet foot, dry foot policy that gives Cubans residency will soon come to an end. During the last 12 months, both Cubans and Cuban Americans have witnessed things many thought they would never see. But in many ways, Cuba remains an isolated nation, where the freedoms taken for granted here are still not available there. But despite that, many remain cautiously optimistic about the future. Rick Herrero says real change in Cuba will be slow, but he believes that a policy of engagement will eventually bring rewards.
We are fighting 50 years of severed relations, of conflict, of deep distrust between the United States and Cuba. It's going to take a while to overcome that, but we've already made some pretty significant strides over the last 12 months.
Few doubt that the last year has been the beginning of a long and complex process. Although some business deals have been made, the US economic embargo remains firmly in place, and Cuba is still the only single-party state in the Americas. But many remain quietly optimistic that long-lasting change will eventually come. Andy Gallagher, Al Jazeera, Miami, Florida.